It's 7:30 in the evening across India. I am Tanvi Taneja. Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll bring you the day's big stories from across India and the world. And with me today from Washington, D.C. is my colleague, Caroline Malone. Hello, Caroline.
Good morning, Tanvi. It's 10 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. and 4 in the afternoon across Central Europe. Coming up in the next 30 minutes. There's a possible US shutdown in just 2 days' time, and we have more on legal trouble for the former President Trump. But back to you first for more on the headlines.
US government warns employees that a shutdown appears to be imminent as Congress remains deadlocked over how to secure sufficient funding for the next fiscal. Canada remains committed to building closer ties with India, says Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, following the row over the killing of a Khalistani terrorist on Canadian soil. At least 57 people have been killed and over 60 injured in two separate bombings in Pakistani mosques on Friday, a day after Prophet Muhammad's birthday. And India now sits at the fourth spot on the Asian Games 2023 table with 8 golds and 32 medals overall. Boxer Nikhat and the men's badminton team storm into their semis. First news from Asia. At least 57 people have been killed and more than 60 injured in Pakistan in 2 different blasts on Friday. Over 52 have been killed in a suicide attack on a religious gathering near a mosque in the Balochistan province. The bomber detonated himself near a police vehicle. This was a rare attack on civilians in Balochistan, where Islamist militants have largely targeted security forces in recent times. Now, amid events marking the birthday of Prophet Muhammad, a second blast at a mosque in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa claimed 5 lives. No group has claimed responsibility for these attacks so far. However, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan has denied any involvement in these blasts. Attacks by militants in Pakistan's restive provinces that border Afghanistan have been on the rise ahead of the general elections scheduled for January 2024. On to America now. India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar is in Washington, D.C. Speaking at a discussion on India's role in a new Pacific order in the American capital, India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar asserted on building reliable and resilient supply chain for the world centered around the Pacific.
I think key issues today in the world which center particularly around the Pacific. One of them is the building of reliable and resilient supply chains because the experiences of the last few years have taught us their importance.
India and the United States have agreed to continue their cooperation in areas of defense, space and clean energy. This comes after Indian External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar's bilateral meeting with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Washington on Thursday. A report.
The meeting between New Delhi and Washington has got much global attention as it comes amid diplomatic standoff between India and Canada. India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken discussed major global issues during their wide-ranging talks. This was the highest-level interaction between the two countries after the G20 summit in New Delhi.
Good to be back here, and we of course had the Prime Minister here this summer. We thank the US for all the support at the G20 summit, and I actually look forward to seeing you in Delhi.
The two leaders also discussed key outcomes of India's G20 presidency.
It's a pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Foreign Minister Jaishankar, here to the State Department, back to Washington. We've had very good discussions over the last weeks, of course, at the G20, in New York at the General Assembly.
The two top diplomats also laid the groundwork for the 5th edition of India-US 2+2 ministerial dialogue to be held in New Delhi. Abhishek Bose for DD India.
The US-India Strategic Partnership Forum hosted a luncheon discussion with Dr. S. Jaishankar in Washington, D.C. Discussions were focused on strengthening India-US commercial ties, increased collaboration in the fields of emerging technology, and creating new resilient supply chains. Earlier on Thursday, Dr. S. Jaishankar also met United States Trade Representative Ambassador Catherine Tai and discussed ways of expanding trade and economic relationship between the two countries and its broader significance. The External Affairs Minister also met members of Congress, administration, business and think tank heads at the India House. Still with America. Now, lawmakers in the United States are scrambling to pass a spending bill to avert a government shutdown, with the two chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives, taking divergent paths of advancing their separate spending plans. My colleague Caroline Malone is in Washington. She gives us more on this and other stories making headlines around the world. Caroline, can a resolution be reached before Saturday's deadline?
Well, Tanvi, it's looking less and less likely that any kind of agreement on government spending can be reached before the deadline. And in fact, the US government has started notifying federal workers that a shutdown appears to be imminent. Congress remains deadlocked over how to secure sufficient funding for a new fiscal year as Saturday night's deadline looms. A shutdown would place thousands of government workers on unpaid leave and severely curtail the work of many government agencies. Efforts are underway to pass a temporary spending measure before the midnight deadline. DD India correspondent William Denslow has more.
Late on Thursday on Capitol Hill, House Republicans voted and passed a series of spending bills. But, and it is a major caveat, these spending bills aren't enough to prevent a government shutdown, and it is incredibly likely that those bills will die in the Democrat-controlled Senate anyway. There are also hopes that the Senate's path to avert a shutdown will be successful. The Senate voted 76-22 to open debate on a possible stopgap bill. Now, this would fund the government through November 17th. It includes provisions such as $6 billion in funding for Ukraine, a further $6 billion for disaster relief. However, there is expected to be a huge amount of opposition from Republicans in the House, in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, especially from more right-wing members of the Republican Party, looking at specifically the House Freedom Caucus. We've heard from Matt Gaetz, who is a member of that caucus in the Republican Party in the House. He said that he would flatly reject any efforts that he says would advance Democrats' agendas. Republicans want to see slashed government spending going forward in any kind of a bill. He's also threatened to essentially to remove the Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy from his role if there's any kind of bipartisan coalescing going forward as this government shutdown deadline looms this weekend. So there's a huge amount of concern that lawmakers will not be able to find any kind of common solutions before the Saturday night deadline in the nation's capital. We've heard from a Republican senator from Maine, Susan Collins, when asked about whether she thought that lawmakers could reach a deal in time. She says that it's impossible to tell. William Denslow in New York, reporting for DD India.
The International Monetary Fund has said that the looming shutdown of the US government poses an avoidable risk to the nation's economy. An IMF spokesperson told reporters that we certainly are urging all parties to come together to reach a consensus and find a way forward. We do see a shutdown as an avoidable risk for the US economy. The US President Joe Biden has called the MAGA, or Make America Great Again, election slogan that was popularized by the former US President Donald Trump a threat to democracy during an address in Arizona. Biden's criticism of Trump comes as the former president faces 4 criminal indictments, but he's still the frontrunner for the Republican Party's presidential nomination.
And there's something dangerous happening in America now. There's an extremist movement that does not share the basic beliefs in our democracy. The MAGA movement. Not every Republican, not even a majority of Republicans, adhere to the MAGA extremist ideology.
Well, US House Republicans held an impeachment hearing against President Biden on Thursday. The Republicans leading the inquiry are probing into the finances and lucrative business dealing of Biden's son, Hunter, promising to provide accountability. They accuse Hunter Biden of selling access to Joe Biden while he was vice president and say there is enough evidence to investigate him as the current president for bribery and abuse of power. Meanwhile, a New York Court of Appeals on Thursday refused to delay Donald Trump's scheduled October 2nd civil fraud trial. Legal teams for the former US president had accused the trial judge of wrongly refusing to throw out the case. But 2 days ago, a state judge ruled that Trump and his family systematically and dishonestly overestimated their assets and net worth in order to secure more favorable loan and insurance terms. Trump was sued in September 2022 by State Attorney General Letitia James, who's seeking at least $250 million in penalties. Razor wires, a river, and round-the-clock patrols by security services have failed to contain an influx of migrants at the US-Mexico border. Here are more details in this report.
These are the migrants crossing a border river between the United States and Mexico. The group is among thousands of people from countries like Venezuela and Honduras who the U.S. state of Texas signed an emergency declaration to seek funding for additional services. Meanwhile, billionaire Elon Musk has waded into the migrant crisis debate. He said that he visited the Texas border with local officials to get an unfiltered view of the situation.
You know, I think we want to do both things. Smooth out legal immigration and then stop sort of a flow of people that is of such a magnitude that is actually leading to a collapse of social services, where even America's largest city, New York, is buckling under the pressure of just how many illegal immigrants are going to New York.
As concerns over illegal immigration grow, the crisis has become a major challenge for US President Joe Biden ahead of the 2024 elections.
Well, more than two-thirds of the 120,000 ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh have now fled into Armenia. A mass exodus began and continues after Azerbaijan's lightning military victory against the breakaway region a few days ago.
These ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh who have migrated to neighboring Armenia are unsure about their future. They have become destitute and homeless. Fearing for their life, they had to hastily abandon their home, leaving everything behind.
I have a wife, 3 children, son-in-law, 3 grandchildren. I do not know where they are. We left everything behind.
Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev has promised to protect the rights of Karabakh's Christian Armenians. These refugees grieved separation of their family members. Although discordant voices have begun to surface, Lebanese Armenians gathered near the embassy of Azerbaijan in Lebanon to protest against Azerbaijan's military operation. Protesters holding banners and Nagorno-Karabakh's flags briefly clashed with the security forces.
We are here to demand our rights, our lawful right that is being stripped from us. What happened in 1915 is happening again. They are treating us the same way. We are here to protest this, and we want our land.
Earlier, Karabakh Armenian authorities accepted Azerbaijan's conditions and said that the breakaway Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh will cease to exist from the 1st of January 2024. They also signed a decree to dissolve all state institutions by the end of 2023.
Well, Slovakia's 3-time Prime Minister Robert Fico, who has a good chance of returning to power in an election on Saturday, has pledged to end military aid to Ukraine. Well, Slovakia had supplied military equipment to the eastern neighbour in the past, but may not do so if Fico gets into power again. When Fico resigned as Prime Minister in 2018, it was due to protests against the murder of an investigative journalist.
We are a peaceful country. We'll not send a single round to Ukraine, and we will push for the European Union to use all its weight and support peace talks as quickly as possible.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is meeting a former commander of the Wagner Group over a month after the mercenary organization's founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, died in a plane crash. In a meeting with Andrei Troshchev, Putin discussed how volunteer units could fight in Ukraine. The Kremlin said that Wagner mercenaries now work for Russia's defense ministry. Wagner founder Prigozhin died in a plane crash in Russia in August, 2 months after he led a short-lived rebellion against the Russian government.
Andrei Nikolaevich, I would like to begin the meeting by speaking to you in the first place. At the last meeting, we talked about you working on forming volunteer units that can perform various combat tasks, above all, of course, in the zone of special military operation. You have been fighting for over a year in one of those units. You know how it is done. You know about the issues that need to be resolved in advance so that the combat work goes in the best and most successful way.
Well, DD India's correspondent Megumi Lim has more on the story from Kyiv.
Well, that's right. Andrei Troshchev and Putin met, and this is basically Putin's way of showing the people in Russia that he is still in control of the Wagner mercenary group, even after, as you mentioned, the short-lived mutiny was carried out in June, led by Prigozhin, who also, as you mentioned, was killed in a plane crash in August. Now, Andrei Troshchev is a very decorated war veteran in the Russian wars fighting in Afghanistan and Chechnya. He was awarded the Hero of Russia medal, which is the highest medal in Russia. And as you said, he now works for the defense ministry. This is something that Prigozhin has railed against very strongly when the defense ministry requested Wagner fighters to be absorbed into the Russian defense ministry. This is what sparked off tensions between Prigozhin and the defense ministry, and also then eventually led to the rebellion itself. But the fact that Troshchev now works for the defense ministry shows that Putin is comfortable working with Troshchev, and he is someone that Putin has been trying to appoint to replace Prigozhin after the mutiny. Now, as you said, the meeting is where they discussed how to use volunteer units in Ukraine in the war, but it is unclear what kind of implications or influence this may have out on the battlefield. But we have seen some movements among Wagner fighters where many of them, when they followed Prigozhin after the mutiny to move to Belarus, are now we're seeing many of them leaving Belarus to come back to Russia. So we may be seeing more Wagner fighter boots on the ground in Ukraine in the coming weeks or months.
Well, that's it from me here in Washington, D.C. Back to you, Tanvi, in the studio.
Thank you, Caroline. Have a great weekend. Caroline Malone joining us all in New Delhi from Washington, D.C. You're watching DD India Global. Still to come on the show. Effects of climate change are seeping into the heart of Switzerland, where the iconic glaciers are succumbing to an unprecedented crisis. A big relief for Russian Paralympians as they get the nod to compete in the Paris 2024 Paralympics. Welcome back. You're watching DD India Global. I am Tanvi Taneja. On to the diplomatic row between India and Canada now. Balraj Singh Nijjar, the son of slain Hardeep Singh Nijjar, has made new claims about his father following Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's allegations. He has said that Hardeep Singh Nijjar used to interact with Canadian intelligence services very frequently. During an interview to the Canadian press, he said his father met regularly with Canadian intelligence officers before he was shot dead. His father met with Canadian Security Intelligence Service officers once or twice a week. Hardeep Singh Nijjar also met the intelligence services 1 or 2 days before his alleged murder. The meetings had started in February and the frequency increased in recent months. Hardeep Singh Nijjar was told that there were threats to his life, and his father was also advised to stay at home. Meanwhile, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has affirmed that Canada remains dedicated to strengthening its relationship with New Delhi.
Extremely important that all of us continue to engage constructively and seriously with the government of India. India is a growing economic power, an important geopolitical player.
And now let's take a look at other stories making news around the world. In a harrowing incident, a British school bus overturned on a motorway following a collision with a car on Friday. The crash resulted in one female being rushed to the hospital, while 50 people are receiving treatment at the scene. Alder Hey Children's Hospital and Arroway Park Hospital have both declared major incidents as they work to provide necessary medical care. After a lengthy strike, the Writers Guild of America finally met with their leadership to discuss the ratification of a new contract. The meeting ended on a high note as Guild members gave a standing ovation to their union leaders. Meanwhile, the Screen Actors Guild, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists Actors Union, is preparing for negotiations with studios next week. Kosovo's president has accused Serbia of orchestrating a recent shootout between armed men and the Kosovo police, heightening concerns over stability in the region. Serbia denied involvement, blaming Kosovo for mistreating ethnic Serbs. The deadly gun battle has prompted new international concern over stability in Kosovo, which has an ethnic Albanian majority. The acute repercussions of climate turbulence are seeping into the heart of Switzerland, where the iconic glaciers are succumbing to an unprecedented crisis. These majestic behemoths, which have stood resilient for over centuries, have been subjected to an alarming rate of ice melt. Their imposing volumes have dwindled by a staggering 10% within the last 2 years, leaving behind a hauntingly depleted landscape. Now, we all have our stories of struggle, stories of survival post the COVID-19 pandemic, but it will take time for all of us to truly recover. According to an annual survey now, Hong Kongers are the glummest they have ever been for a decade. This annual survey is called HK.We Care. Last year, 1/10 of people questioned said that they were unhappy. This year, 1/4 did. Overall, Hong Kong had a happiness score of 59% this year, a big drop from 66% last year. DD India correspondent Andrew Wood has more from Hong Kong.
Well, Hong Kongers, like most people around the world, have had a pretty miserable few years because of COVID, because of the pandemic. But that's gone now, and still Hong Kongers do seem to be less happy than they were a year ago. And I think the political situation has affected Hong Kongers. Last year, the survey gave a figure or a mark of 4.7 out of 10 for Hong Kongers' satisfaction with the way the government was working and the political situation. That's fallen now to 4.2. So remember, we had, just before the COVID pandemic, there were very big protests in Hong Kong. More than 1 million people coming out on the street to protest against new laws, which they felt that meant that Beijing would interfere with the running of Hong Kong more. Well, since then, of course, Hong Kong has been subject to a very strict national security law that's been imposed on the territory. It removes an awful lot of the freedoms that a lot of Hong Kongers thought had been guaranteed by Beijing when it handed over, or rather when Britain handed Hong Kong back to Beijing back in 1997. And the political situation is causing issues as well with older people. Older people are saying that it's more, some people are saying that it's difficult because their relatives have left Hong Kong because of the political situation, so they find it more difficult to get on with life because they don't have people to care for them in the same way anymore. In Hong Kong, I'm Andrew Wood reporting for DD India.
And on to sporting action now. India's medal rush continues at the 19th Asian Games underway in Guangzhou, China. Two-time world champion boxer Nikhat secured a Paris Olympics berth and assured herself of a medal as she cantered to the 50 kg semi-finals of the Asian Games on Friday. Fighting in her third bout of the tournament, Nikhat needed less than 3 minutes to notch a facile RSC win over Nasser Hanan of Jordan in the quarterfinals. Indian men's badminton team scripted history by securing a medal at the Asian Games after 37 years as they beat Nepal 3-0 in the quarterfinals. India will face the winner between Indonesia and Korea in the semi-final for a spot in the finals. Bopanna Rutuja assures silver in mixed doubles. The duo will play Chinese Taipei Sung Hao Huang and En Shuo Liang in the final. And the Indian squash team too won a bronze medal. The women's squash team of Anahat, Joshna, Tanvi and Deepika displayed incredible resilience and skill at the game. Palak Gulia clinched gold medal in the 10-meter air pistol shooting event, adding another glorious chapter to the nation's shooting legacy. And Russian athletes will now be able to compete as full participants or neutral athletes at the next year's Paris 2024 Paralympics. After the International Paralympic Committee, IPC members voted against a full ban of Russia on Friday. The IPC statement read, at the IPC General Assembly in Bahrain, IPC members voted 74:65 against a motion to fully suspend National Paralympic Committee Russia for breaches of its constitutional membership obligations. So with that, it's a wrap in this edition of DD India Global. Do let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. You can connect with us on Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram at DD India Live. You can also find us online on YouTube at DD India. We will be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Tanvi Taneja from my entire team in New Delhi. Thanks for watching. Namaskar.
Do you know that 800 million people around